Hi, and welcome to Jankensgaard on Risk, the YouTube channel dedicated to the theory and practice of risk management. In this video, we're going to come up with some best practices when developing a risk register. The risk register is the crowning achievement of many enterprise risk management programs, but sometimes contains data that is inconsistent and imprecise. The full discussion about how to create a risk register is found in my book, Empowered Enterprise Risk Management, co-authored with Petter Kapstad. There's also more information on riskbudgeting.se, and as they say here on YouTube, please like and subscribe. So if there's one thing that enterprise risk management programs seem to have in common, it's the risk register. They may not call it that, they may call it something else like a risk inventory or the risk universe very ambitiously or something, but the idea is the same, that it's a list. We compile and describe the risks that matter. So we're basically talking about risks that deserve managerial attention. And with the information provided through the risk register, we can then utilize that to craft appropriate risk responses so that something is done about it. So one of the things that a well-designed risk register will do is that it will close the risk information gap. The executives and directors of a company, they often struggle to stay informed, and they would like to know about the firm's exposures, but the complexity is such that it can still be hard. That there's plenty of evidence from executives and board of directors simply not knowing the firm's exposures, and service confirmed this, that this is getting some visibility on the risk can actually be hard. So the risk register is a way to systematically work towards closing this risk information gap. So when it works well, the executives and directors receive this kind of information, relevant information about the major risks on a timely and ongoing basis. And another benefit is that the firm delivers on outside expectations in terms of, for analysts and investors wanting to know, what are your risks here? What are we in for? And what are you guys doing about that? Well, with the risk register in place, the firm has what it takes to answer that question in a satisfactory way. Like it's hard to find an annual report these days that doesn't contain some version of the risk register, and so that's a tangible benefit here. You're seen to be doing proper risk management, and there's sort of a check on that box. And all right, so the risk mapping required to get the risk register in place is carried out by the business units and the corporate functions then. So they have to provide the relevant information here, and you have to give them some kind of instruction then, like, what are we talking about here? What are we looking for? And how are we going to do things? I mean, this is about how we construct it on a fundamental level, right? But what's even supposed to go in there? And it's important because one of the major benefits of an enterprise risk management program is the fact that we establish some kind of a risk language, right? We unify the approach here. We're not letting the units, come up with their own definitions and understanding of things. We try to streamline all of this so that everyone means the same thing when they're using a particular term. So this is one of, absolutely one of the benefits of such a program, so that this is done across the enterprise in a very coherent way, and that brings a lot of benefits. But if we start with what you should not ask for, then that would be some kind of traffic light color approach to risk data, where you do identify a certain number of risks, but you attach a color to them. Like you signal that, okay, we think this is very serious, so it gets a red here. This risk over here is more yellow, we think. And all right. There's also the verbal descriptions, where somebody writes up a long document and just describes endlessly, in endless detail, this particular risk. We don't really need that either. I mean, the problem here is basically that there's no basis for comparison. This is going to be one of the key purposes of a risk register, to put things on a comparable basis, right? And that doesn't happen with traffic light colors, for example. I mean, what red is to you may not mean be red in my book, so to speak. And it's not clear at all what the exact level of threat is, from just a color, we may have completely different understandings of what red implies, for example. And these verbal descriptions, well, they're long and tedious and quickly outdated, and who sits around reading that sort of stuff? So that's not going to be very actionable. We need something that is more to the point and more comparable then, which is, again, one of the key objectives here, that we want whatever goes into the register to have similar kind of interpretation, so that we can start comparing, right? And apples are not oranges. And so we're going to attempt a definition here of what should go into the register. We think of it as a risk factor defined as a stochastic, meaning uncertain variable that impacts corporate performance. And we're going to add to that in a material way. Speaking of oranges, I mean, if we're buying oranges for the fruit basket once a week, we're exposed to the price of oranges, which could be quite likely to go up. But if it's limited to the fruit basket, we can survive that. It's not going to be a big deal. So we're not going to put that in the risk register. It's going to be about the risks that matter. We also want there to be a clearly identified causal mechanism, so that a risk factor causes an impact on corporate performance. So there needs to be a check on that as well, that the risk factor operates on corporate performance in a fairly direct and clear way. So we're going to try to make the register about causes of variability in corporate performance rather than consequences. I mean, when you see risk registers in the real world, there's a lot of brainstorming preceding that and going into that, and people come up with all sorts of things. They're all somehow bad. Obviously, that's what unifies them. But apart from that, there can be an astonishing amount of variety in terms of what goes in there. And one of the reasons for that is that people confuse causes of variability and consequences of variability. They're not the same thing, and we are going to argue that consequences should be kept out of there. It's for later. All right, so let's say a supply chain breakdown is identified. There's a reasonable threat of that that would clearly hurt performance. You will have a direct negative consequence on our ability to execute our operations, right? So we put that in the risk register. That would cause a negative impact on performance. Whereas a credit rating downgrade, that's also a bad thing, but it would happen if performance were to fall, right? So it's a consequence of variability in performance, and we don't put it in the register. That is not to say that we're not interested in that at all. We are, but it's a different analysis. It comes later in the risk management process. So to have the risk register, be unified and have a similar interpretation of the items that appear in it, we go for causes of variability rather. And this is not to say either that we can't mix up different types of risk. I mean, clearly that's one of the main purposes here, that we can get all these different sorts of risk into one view. Like you have market risk and credit risk and operational risk. All these things are perfectly possible to put in a risk map. It's just that we have to be able to argue that they are causing performance to potentially go lower. Another objective here is to achieve the right level of precision. So if somebody says, well, we have credit risk, there's going to be credit risk. Well, that's more of a broad category. It's not very insightful. We can't have any useful discussions based on that, really. And I mean, part of the benefits of such an exercise as this is to generate good discussions, right? We want to have the focus in the right place, and that's too broad. Credit losses, okay, that's more tangible. We can actually start quantifying that to some extent, but even more so if we pinpoint the source here. Maybe it's customer ABC, and they're very important to us, and we're actually seeing some signs that they might default here. Well, okay, now we can start having some good discussions around what to do. I mean, this is very precise, and the causality is very clear. If they do default, we're in for some trouble here, and so this is much more useful and something that could very well go into the risk register. All right, quantification is we're going to support that. We need it because it's what connects these risk factors with the bottom line, and it makes everything comparable. And it's going to be hard, yes, but not even trying is actually even worse. I mean, because what then is going to be the basis for our decisions? Our feelings, our hunches, our intuitions. I mean, there's no real solid candidate there for what should support decision making in the absence of some quantitative information. And we should then go for these probability and impact numbers, yes. And I'm aware of cases where people dreaded a certain risk and were absolutely terrified by that prospect, but then started and it would have gone into the risk register as some kind of major concern then. But it turned out upon further investigations that the actual financial impact from that wasn't so bad. At the end of the day, it was implied a potential loss that was perfectly possible to deal with. So that's the kind of insights you arrive at when you start quantifying things. You're not sort of carried away by your instincts and feelings, right? So we get away from that, and we don't want our risk management to be based on those sort of things, right? So probability and impact, yes. If you take the product of those, that is referred to here as the cost of risk. Probability times impact is cost of risk. And that gives you an indication of the scope for value creating risk mitigation. If the higher this number, the more you can reasonably spend. You can defend spending a larger amount of risk mitigation when the cost of risk is higher, right? Because risk mitigation is not necessarily free. I mean, it comes at an effort and at a cost, and that cost must be proportionate. Hopefully less than the cost of risk, because then we can argue that we've created some value here. But you can definitely get over management of risk whenever the cost of risk mitigation is out of proportion to the cost of risk. And we avoid that better if we go to the trouble of coming up with these probability and impact numbers. All right, so impact, yeah, all these things are hard to quantify, I guess, and the complexity can be tremendous in many cases, and it's all sort of vague possibilities that who on earth could actually quantify that, you might think. But we're going to have to try, because it's all about relative likelihood and the impact of that risk if it were to happen. I mean, that is risk, probability times impact, and we have to try to get a grip on it. And so hard as it may be, we're going to try to quantify first impact then, and it can be understood in different ways. We're going to be trying to relate this to some bottom line in the financial statements, like cash flow and net income, over some planning horizon. I mean, this should connect to some actual forecast numbers in the financials. We're not doing this as a completely independent sideshow. It should be integrated with the financial planning here. And even better, in terms of comparability, is when you quantify the net present value of the impact. You take into consideration the fact that it can have an impact even beyond the planning horizon, and over many years, it has a negative impact on our performance. So if you discount that back to present value for all the risk factors, well, then you have a very solid basis for comparison. They're very much on comparable terms now. So, but maybe for practical reasons, maybe it's more often going to be about the cash flow impact over some defined planning horizon. So it is always relative to some expectation here. That's where the planning comes into the picture here. Like we're going to have a cash flow forecast somewhere, and maybe as part of a budget process. And let's say that's 200 million now. If we're putting a risk in the risk register and claiming that if it happens, there's a 30 million negative impact. Well, that must mean that if it happens, cash flow will be 170 million. The expectation minus that impact. So I mean, if the risk factor has a probability of more than 50%, it should be in the budget already. And we have to make sure that it's not somehow incorporated into the forecast that we see in the spreadsheet, because that will be double counting them. We can't have it in the register also and sort of put that on top of a number that already incorporates some version of that event. So that's important to remember as well. All right, so quantifying probabilities is, if anything, worse than quantifying impact in the minds of many people. And the basic problem here is that we don't have known probabilities or known probability distributions. They are, found for things like a roll of a die, but not much outside that. And that's just an unfortunate fact of life. We're dealing with wild uncertainty, as Mr. Taleb has put it. The world is just completely unpredictable and non-linear and complex, and that's what we're dealing here. So there will be there will have to be subjective probabilities at the end of the day, and that's going to be fine. That's still the best we can do. We still have to sort of roughly estimate, what we're talking about here, as to have something that supports decision making. And we can make a note here that subjective probabilities, they follow the same rules as the more objective ones, right? That we have to first define a sample space that will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for a normal die, and this is useful because sometimes people understand the word probability differently. And if you say that there's a 30% probability of rain tomorrow, somebody might understand that in terms of there being 3 out of 10 meteorologists who believe it's going to rain tomorrow, which is probably not what you had in mind, right? So it's good to actually set up the range of possible outcomes that we're even granting as possible, and define your sample space or outcome space so that we always know the probability relative to what. So the reference class is defined now. So, and they're still going to have to add up to 100% at the end of this. So we have to make sure that. So whatever, when the risk doesn't happen, that can be allocated to various other different possible outcomes, right? Some of which could be better. So, all right. So here's the thing: we have to use the best available expertise. Pool the people who we think know best. And the same goes for data. We try to get the best data possible whenever we can find it to make this a sort of fact-based exercise. So, for example, you could ask your best engineer or pool a group of them and have them come up with some answer to questions like these. For example, if we're talking about 100 years repeated all over many times over, and in how many would this kind of machine break down, you think? Well, if they say 3, probably around 3, then okay, you have a subjective probability now, 3%. And that gives you something to go by when there's no data around. But if there are failure rates, we have data on that we of course will inspect those data and learn from them. For that type of machine, in the type of circumstances that we operated, we tend to see a failure, in such and such a number of cases. So when data is available, we use that to inform ourselves, possibly complemented with expert opinion. What's important to remember here that we need to de-bias our estimates. It's well understood that people are suffering from various biases that affect these estimates. For example, and we have to check ourselves for that and do what we can to get rid of them, take them out of the equation here. And we have things like overconfidence and optimism, all these things that people make people gravitate towards a more favorable outlook on life, you know. But we have to be realistic and fact-based and debias ourselves here. That's when subjective probabilities are okay. And then it's on a best effort basis. And once we do this, you know, we come up with some probabilities for various risk factors that have been put into the register. And we also have an impact number here. Okay, now we can start comparing, you know, okay, here we have more probability, you know, high probability of happening, but the impact is less, you know. And you can start comparing and making your priorities and directing your attention towards, you know, the risks that are the most threatening given their probability and impact numbers here. And so we have some basis for decision making, and then we can put that into a map and present it in a nice way to the board of directors and all these decision makers at the top of the firm who needs to be informed about all this. So the visualization is going to be important as well. But anyway, okay, this is a basic risk register now that is informing us about the risks that matter. We can extend this and make it much more advanced. We're going to do that in another tutorial. You can add more columns here with more information. You gradually get more sophisticated and improve your decision-making support even further. So, but that's for another time. We're going to conclude here now that the risk register is a centerpiece of many ERM programs, but the data in it is often inconsistent and imprecise. We shouldn't really go for traffic light colors and verbal descriptions, much too imprecise. Rather, we go for quantifying probabilities and impacts that connects with the bottom line, you know, the financial numbers that we use to manage the firm. And it removes a lot of these biases that you get from hunches and basic instincts, to put it that way. So we have something that we can use rather for determining the appropriate risk response, which should be proportionate to the probability times impact. And we have concluded that the risk register should contain primarily risk factors that impact corporate performance. We save the consequences of variability for later. We prefer not to mix them up in the register. That's a separate analysis that we conduct later in the risk management process. All right, those were the conclusions. Please consult my books for more reading: Corporate Foreign Exchange Risk Management and Empowered Risk Management. Riskbudgeting.se. You'll find more information there. Please like and subscribe. Have a good day.